Have you ever had one of those moments where the air just feels heavy, like the atmosphere itself is trying to warn you to turn back? That's how it started for me 3 years ago, and I still can't shake the feeling of that thick Louisiana heat pressing against my chest. My name is Viggo Stallone, and yeah, I know the name sounds like a character from an action flick, but back then, I was just a guy who spent too much time underground. Being a professional cave explorer based out of Miami means I'm used to tight spaces and things that go bump in the dark, but those are usually just falling rocks or shifting silt. This was different. Why was a guy like me, who thrives in limestone tunnels, heading into the Atchafalaya Basin for a solo cabin retreat? Call it a recentering trip. I'd spent the last 6 months mapping a flooded system in the Yucatan, and I just wanted some fresh air, even if that air was 90% humidity. I'd heard the stories, of course. Every explorer hears them, tales of things that live in the margins of the map, things that don't like being found. But I've stared down a so-called dogman lair in the deeper parts of the Appalachians and found nothing but old bones and coyote dens. I'm a skeptic by trade. If I can't shine a 1,000 lumen flashlight on it, it doesn't exist. I left Miami at 4 a.m. in my old Tacoma, pushing through the Panhandle and crossing the Mississippi by mid-afternoon. It's about a 10-hour haul if you don't stop for more than gas and beef jerky. By the time I hit the gravel roads outside of Henderson, the October sun was hanging low and gold over the cypress trees. It was a beautiful day, honestly, crisp for the south, with the leaves just starting to turn into those deep burnt oranges. The cabin I'd rented was deep, off the grid deep. To get there you have to leave your truck at a landing and take a flat-bottomed skiff through a maze of Spanish moss and black water. The guy who rented it to me, an old-timer named Bayou, wouldn't even look me in the eye when he handed over the oars. "You got a weapon on you, son?" he asked, his voice like dry husks. I patted my belt where my hunting knife sat and gestured to the pelican case in the skiff containing my 4570 lever action. I'm a hunter by hobby. I don't go into the bush without a way to defend myself. Bill just nodded, looking out at the water. "The moon is waxing," he muttered. "Don't go looking for things that don't want to be seen. And for God's sake, stay inside after the crickets stop chirping." I laughed it off at the time. Just more swamp lore for the tourists, right? I reached the cabin just as the sun dipped below the waterline. It was a small, stilted structure made of cypress logs that looked like they'd been there since the Civil War. Inside, it smelled of cedar and old wood smoke. I unpacked my gear, rope, carabiners, my mapping kit, and enough rations for a week. I figured I'd spend my days scouting for any unmapped sinkholes. There are more of them in the Bayou than people realize. But as I stood on the porch, watching the shadows stretch across the water, I realized the crickets hadn't started their evening chorus yet. It was dead silent. No birds, no frogs, no breeze. Just the sound of my own breathing, which felt way too loud in that stillness. That was the first time I felt it, the micro question in the back of my mind. Why is the swamp holding its breath? I went inside and bolted the door, telling myself it was just the change in environment. I'm used to the silence of caves, but this was a different kind of quiet. It was an expectant quiet. I cleaned my rifle, a habit that usually calms me down, but my hands were shaking slightly. Around midnight, I heard the first sound. It wasn't a growl or howl, it was the sound of something heavy, very heavy, walking through the shallow water beneath the cabin's stilts. Slosh, pause, slosh, pause. It sounded rhythmic, like a man walking, but the weight behind each step made the floorboards beneath my feet vibrate. I grabbed my headlamp and clicked it to the lowest setting, creeping toward the floor vent. When I peered down, I didn't see a monster. I saw a pair of eyes reflecting the dim light, amber, glowing, and positioned way too high off the ground for any wolf or gator. Those eyes, they didn't just reflect light, they seemed to hold it, burning with a predatory intelligence that sent a physical chill down my spine. I froze, my thumb hovering over the safety of the 4570, but the sloshing stopped directly beneath me. The creature let out a low, vibrating huff, a sound that carried the scent of wet fur and something metallic, like old blood. Then, silence returned, and for 3 hours I sat on that floorboard, a rifle braced against my shoulder, waiting for a breakthrough that never came. When the sun finally bled through the moss-draped trees, I realized I hadn't blinked in what felt like an eternity. Determined to prove it was just a stray black bear or a particularly large swamp wolf, I headed out at dawn to find tracks. As a cave explorer, I'm trained to read the ground, silt and mud, tell stories if you know how to listen. What I found near the stilted supports wasn't a bear print, it was a terrifying hybrid. 5-toed, like a human hand, but with elongated, hooked claws that had gouged deep into the muck. The stride was nearly 4 feet long, suggesting something that stood 7 or 8 feet tall. My mind raced back to the camp stories I'd heard while working in the basin years ago. The legend of the Rougarou. The locals say it's a curse, a person who transformed into a beast for breaking Lenten traditions or through a blood debt. They say it hunts the Bayou, looking for someone to bleed so it can pass the curse along. I'd always laughed at the werewolf of the swamp tales, but looking at those prints, the skepticism I carried from Miami felt like a paper shield. I decided then that I wasn't staying the full week. I'd scout for one more day, keep my rifle hot, and head back to Bayou's landing at first light. But the swamp had other plans. About 2 miles from the cabin, I found what I had actually come for. A limestone collapse hidden behind a curtain of weeping willows. It was a vertical shaft, a glory hole that likely led into an uncharted cave system. This was my element. Forgetting the fear of the night for a moment, I rigged the line to a sturdy cypress and began my rappel. The air inside the shaft was cool, a welcome break from the humid morning. But as I descended, the smell returned. That copper and wet dog stench was trapped in the stagnant air of the cave. I hit the floor, my boots squelching in something that wasn't mud. I clicked my headlamp to full power, and the cavern ignited in a grisly display. This wasn't a dogman lair, it was a larder. The bones of deer, nutria, and even a shredded kayak were piled against the far wall. And then I saw it, resting on a ledge about 20 feet away. It was hunched over, its back a mass of matted, dark grey fur and knotted muscle. It was the Rougarou, and it was eating. The sound of it cracking bone was like dry wood snapping in a fire. I tried to back away, to slowly reach for my ascender and climb out of that hellhole. But my gear snagged on a jagged piece of flowstone. It clinked. The creature didn't growl. It simply stopped moving. It turned its head 180 degrees, like an owl, revealing a face that was a nightmare of human features stretched over a canine skull. Its eyes, those amber lanterns, locked onto mine. In a blur of movement that defied its size, it lunged. I barely had time to swing my rifle up as the beast's claws raked across my left shoulder, tearing through my tactical vest and flesh like it was wet tissue paper. I fired around blindly, the muzzle flash illuminating the cavern in a strobe light of horror. The roar of the 45-70 in that enclosed space was deafening, but it bought me 2 seconds of confusion. I didn't wait to see if I'd hit it. I grabbed my rope and began a frantic, adrenaline-fueled climb, feeling the hot stink of blood running down my arm and the terrifying weight of the beast jumping at the wall below me. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as I hauled myself up that rope, every inch a battle against the searing pain in my shoulder. Below me, the cavern echoed with a sound that wasn't a bark or a scream, but a guttural, weight gurgle of pure frustration. I reached the lip of the shaft and rolled onto the mossy earth, gasping for air that felt too thin to breathe. I didn't look back. I knew it was coming. I scrambled to my feet, clutching my rifle in my right hand and left arm hanging leaded and warm with flowing blood. The sunny October afternoon now felt like a mockery, the bright light making the shadows between the cypress knees look like hiding places for 1,000 more monsters. I made it back to the cabin in record time, my tracks marked by a rhythmic crimson drip. I slammed the heavy cypress door and threw the iron bolt, sinking to the floor as the room spun. I had to move fast. The Rougarou had tasted my blood, and if the stories Bew hinted at were true, that meant the hunt had only just begun. I stripped off my shredded vest and bit back a scream as I poured high-proof bourbon from my flask over the 4 deep gouges in my shoulder. It wasn't just a wound. The skin around the edges was already turning a bruised, sickly purple, pulsing with a heat that didn't feel natural. I bandaged myself tightly with duct tape and gauze from my medkit, my mind racing through my inventory. I had the 45-70 with 5 rounds left, a hunting knife, and my climbing gear. I also had a small canister of bare, strength pepper spray and a few high-intensity magnesium flares I used for signaling in deep cave systems. "Think, Viggo," I whispered to the empty room. "Think like a surveyor. If I tried to take the skiff now, I'd be a sitting duck on the open water. The Rougarou is a swimmer. It would pull me under before I cleared the first bend. My only chance was to turn the cabin into a fortress and wait for the sun to give me a window to move." As the golden light began to fade into a bruised twilight, the silence returned, heavier than before. Then a soft thud landed on the roof, then another. It was circling, testing the strength of the old structure. Suddenly, the wood above the kitchen area groaned, and a massive, hair-covered claw punched through the ceiling, wood splinters showering the floor. I fired a shot through the hole, the blast shaking the entire cabin. A howl ripped through the night, a sound so full of ancient predatory sorrow that it made my teeth ache. But it didn't retreat. Instead, I heard the sound of wood splintering at the base of the cabin. The thing wasn't trying to get in through the roof anymore. It was trying to tear the stilts out from under me. The cabin tilted 5 degrees to the left, and I felt the sickening lurch of the floorboards. It was smarter than a dog, more patient than a bear. I grabbed my pelican case and my rope, realizing I couldn't stay in the safety of the house. I had to change the terrain. I kicked out the back window facing the descent part of the cypress grove and threw my gear out. As the cabin groaned again, tilting further, I dived into the shadows just as the front stilts gave way with a thunderous crack. I landed in the muck, rolling behind a massive stump, my eyes darting toward the wreckage of the cabin. There, standing atop the slanted roof in the moonlight, was the beast, its fur matted with its own blood and mine, looking like a demonic sentinel. It sniffed the air, its head snapping toward my hiding spot. It knew exactly where I was. The creature leaped from the ruined roof, landing in the swamp with a splash that sounded like a falling tree. I didn't wait for it to recover. I plunged into the dark heart of the cypress grove, my boot sinking into the peat with every desperate stride. My shoulder was a white, hot scream of agony, but the adrenaline acting as a chemical veil kept my legs moving. I knew I couldn't outrun it in a straight sprint, so I headed for the gator backs, a series of narrow limestone ridges that rose just inches above the water level, forming a natural, jagged maze. As a cave explorer, I knew the stability of stone was my only advantage over the shifting mud the beast was built for. I reached the first ridge and scrambled up, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Behind me, I could hear the Rougarou tearing through the brush, its heavy footfalls closing the gap with terrifying speed. I reached into my pack and pulled out one of the magnesium flares, my fingers trembling as I gripped the striker. I needed to see it, and more importantly, I needed to hurt its eyes, which were built for the dimness of the swamp. I turned just as the massive shape cleared a fallen log 10 yards away. I struck the flare. A blinding, violent white light erupted, turning the midnight swamp into a stark, colorless nightmare. The Rougarou shrieked, a sound that transcended animal pain and hit a frequency of pure, human-like agony. It reared up, covering its face with its massive clawed forearms, and in that moment of brilliance, I saw the truth of the lore. Around its neck, partially embedded in the matted fur, was a rusted iron chain, a remnant of whatever man it used to be. I raised the 45-70, aiming for the center of that broad, heaving chest. The rifle kicked, and the beast tumbled back, the bullet finding its mark. But it didn't fall. It let out a guttural roar and charged through the blinding light, driven by a rage that exceeded its fear of the flare. I dropped the spent rifle. There was no time to lever another round, and pulled my hunting knife with my good hand as the beast slammed into me. Its weight felt like a collapsing wall. We tumbled off the ridge and into the black water. Under the surface, the world became a chaotic swirl of silt and bubbles. I felt its teeth graze my ribs, but I jammed the magnesium flare, still burning with underwater intensity, directly into the creature's open maw. The water hissed and boiled. The Rougarou thrashed, releasing its grip of my throat, and I used the last of my strength to shove off its chest and kick toward the surface. I broke the water, coughing and vomiting swamp water, and scrambled back onto the limestone ridge. I didn't see the beast come back up. For a long minute, the only sound was the bubbling of the dying flare beneath the surface and the frantic pounding of my heart. I didn't stay to investigate. I used my climbing rope to tie a makeshift tourniquet over my shoulder and began the agonizing trek back toward the skiff landing, moving with the silent predatory caution I'd learned in the deepest caves of the world. I reached the skiff at dawn, the sky a bruised purple that mirrored my skin. I pushed off into the mist, rowing with one arm until I saw the silhouette of Bayou's dock. The old man was there, standing with a lantern, his face etched with a look that said he'd already written me off as dead. He didn't ask what happened. He just looked at my shoulder, then at the blood on the floor of the skiff, and handed me a flask of something that smelled like kerosene. "You're lucky, Stallone," he whispered. "The moon is setting." I drove back to Miami in a daze, my mind stuck in a loop of those amber eyes and the sound of breaking bone. The doctor said the infection in my shoulder was unidentified, some kind of rare swamp bacteria that required months of specialized antibiotics. But sometimes, during the waxing moon, the scars on my shoulder begin to throb with a heat that feels like it's coming from the inside. I haven't been back to the woods since. I stay in the caves now, because in the dark, I know what I'm looking at. But out there, in the Louisiana sun, some things are better left unmapped. You believe me, don't you?